Greetings. My name is Eileen Kazura. I'm a MPH candidate in the University of Washington's Department of Global Health, and I'm going to talk today about some of the equity dimensions of climate extremes in the Arctic. So I'll start with an introduction to myself and then the Arctic, and then I'll talk about just a couple of really significant climate impacts happening in the Arctic, and then I'll move into three equity considerations. So let's start a little bit about myself. I just came to the University of Washington last year. Previous to that, spent around 5 years living and working in Alaska, where I worked for various youth and community development organizations. And during this time, I managed the Arctic Youth Ambassadors Program, which is a partnership between my organization and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their delegation to the Arctic Council. This was both during the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council from 2015 to 17, and then during the U.S. leadership of the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group from 2017 to 19. I also helped to guide the formation of the Arctic Youth Network, which is a pan-Arctic youth-led organization aiming to increase youth voices and capacity on all Arctic matters. And it has members and leaders from across the Arctic. Because of this background, you'll find that a number of my examples are Alaska focused, which obviously doesn't encapsulate the range of experiences in the Arctic. You'll also note that I'm not a climate researcher. And so what I'm really going to do is focus in on the people and the stories that have really impacted me in my relationship with primarily participants in my programs and people I've met over the course of my time working on Arctic issues. So I hope that you'll find that we can really spend a little bit of time thinking about the lived experience in the Arctic and how that intersects with climate change. And finally, I'll just note that a little bit about my positionality. I'm a white female. I'm in my mid-30s, and I am not from the Arctic, nor am I indigenous. And right now I'm representing an academic institution. And so I by no means mean to assert myself as an expert on any of these issues. And I hope I'm just amplifying some of the stories and messages from people living in the Arctic, but I really implore you to seek out voices of people with deep lived experience in the Arctic, particularly indigenous inhabitants with multi-generational experience. Okay, so where is the Arctic? The Arctic region has a handful of definitions, but generally the Arctic Circle at 66 degrees latitude is one political boundary. And above this line, there's 8 countries which make up the Arctic nations. This is the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and Alaska, Canada, Iceland, with just a little tiny bit of an island off the north coast across the Arctic Circle, Greenland, represented also through the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And who lives in the Arctic? The Arctic as a region has been inhabited for thousands of years, and indigenous people have developed technologies and cultures to sustain life in this really challenging place to live. One of my favorite slogans for an organization is from First Alaskans Institute, which talks about making progress for the next 10,000 years. And I think this really does a nice job of illustrating the time horizon on which people living and having indigenous peoples have about their responsibility to their homeland. And I think also reflects not just the past, but really the long-term time horizon in which they're working with for the future. The map at the right illustrates the wide array of languages and cultures across the region, with language families shaded in similar colors. You can see, for instance, the Inuit, which shaded in dark blue, stretching from the north coast of Alaska on the Arctic Ocean across the top of inhabited northern Canada and into Greenland. These people share many cultural commonalities, such as subsistence practices and food preparation, but of course, language, culture, and daily living conditions differ on many scales, including a micro scale between villages, but also between different country boundaries based on the political and social circumstances of their governmental institutions. And though Indigenous people make up a relatively small proportion of Arctic inhabitants worldwide, they are crucially important when we think about equity and will be the focus of the rest of this presentation. At the Arctic Council, which again is a multilateral governmental forum, Indigenous peoples do have a unique seat at the table through the 6 permanent participant organizations, though they do not have equal representation with the countries, the 8 Arctic countries. But a number of these permanent participant groups represent cross-border groups, such as the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents the Inupiaq of Alaska and the Inuit of Canada and Greenland. And all of their logos of the 6 permanent participants can be seen on the lower left-hand side of this slide. So I just want to touch on two notable impacts of climate change in the Arctic to set up some of the equity considerations. So I'll talk about Arctic sea ice and permafrost thaw. Okay, so by all measures, which might include volume, as shown by this beautiful chart by Zach Labe, extent, or thickness, Arctic sea ice is decreasing. And each season brings questions about the reliability of sea ice, which is really vital to coastal communities for many reasons. The reduction in sea ice and not only in the extent, volume, or thickness of sea ice, as I mentioned on the previous slide, but really also in terms of when it forms and when it goes out in the spring, make communities more vulnerable to storms and storm surges. And this is a photo of Eben Hobson of Utqiagvik walking along the seawall in his town. And you can see this is really a local adaptation to a global problem. Towns and villages that used to be reliably buffered by the sea ice, particularly in autumn and spring, are now having to protect their vital infrastructure from storm surges, flooding, and erosion. And I'll return to sea ice formation later when we talk a little bit about food security. In addition, permafrost thaw is another significant challenge for communities in the Arctic. Nearly all infrastructure in Arctic communities is built on permafrost. And as this permafrost thaws, the ground is destabilized, yielding many issues for inhabitants and communities. The photo on this slide is from the village of Selawik, which is in northwest Alaska. It's a fairly small village outside Kotzebue. It's just a couple miles above the Arctic Circle. It illustrates some obvious infrastructure damage due to permafrost. And communities are really needing to address all sorts of infrastructure losses, faltering homes, community buildings. There's a large number of grave sites and cemeteries that are at risk due to thawing permafrost, and also roads and water treatment facilities. Here you can see this is just a screenshot from a peruse that I did today of the LEO network, which stands for Local Ecological Observer Network, for permafrost thaw. And you can see that it yields additional considerations. And the point I would like to make here is that there's both new opportunities that come from some of these climate extremes and concerns. New opportunities highlighted by the first. There's places in Russia that are growing new crops like soybeans with new terrain that is become available due to thawed permafrost. We can also see the second entry. Some considerations about red dog vine, which is in northwest Alaska. A significant portion of Arctic economy is based on natural resources, and so this sort of significant infrastructure damage, or at least concern or planning for infrastructure damage, is no more protected than small community buildings or homes. I would really suggest, if you are at all interested in kind of getting a sense for what's happening in the Arctic, to subscribe to the LEO network. It's operated out of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and pulls together news stories from all over the Arctic, but also local observations, which, a large number of them are focused on Alaska, but they accept them from all across the world about, just things that are happening in their communities that seem out of the ordinary. And so you'll see reports of things like erosion or bird die-offs, all sorts of different events happening that they're capturing here through the LEO network. Okay, and so now I'll spend the rest of the time talking about just 3 equity concerns regarding climate extremes in the Arctic. And I'm really hoping that you'll see that a number of the climate impacts intersect and amplify each other. And that is what's creating these significant changes and challenges for daily living for Arctic communities. Of course, I just want to reiterate that these 3 issues are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and there certainly are many that are not captured by the next handful of slides. So I'll start by talking about food security. And just to ground us in what food security is, I'll first share a definition provided by the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And it is, again, focused on Alaska, but I think it is a broad and wide-ranging definition that applies more broadly. They say Alaskan Inuit food security is the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem, to access food and to caretake, protect and respect all of life, land, water, and air. It allows for all Inuit to obtain, process, store, and consume sufficient amounts of healthy and nutritious preferred food. Foods physically and spiritually craved and needed from the land, air, and water, which provide for families and future generations through the practice of Inuit customs and spirituality, languages, knowledge, policies, management practices, and self-governance. It includes the responsibility and ability to pass on knowledge to younger generations, the taste of traditional foods rooted in place and season, knowledge of how to safely obtain and prepare traditional foods for medicinal use, clothing, housing, nutrients, and overall, how to be within one's environment. It means understanding that food is a lifeline and a connection between the past and today's self and cultural identity. This photo is of Esau Sinuk, who is an advocate for his home community of Shishmaref, which is in northwest Alaska. This coastal community relies on sea mammals for a large amount of protein, primarily seals and walrus in this community, but also in others, whales. So this is a place where milk is at least $8 a gallon, and as this definition that I've read, but from ICC, really rings home, food security is really about much more than filling the freezer. It is about communities' ability to thrive in the place that they call home. And there are really some challenges that climate change has presented. In Shishmaref, unreliable sea ice has caused challenging conditions for travel by snow machine and boat, and they've become much more dangerous. So I've heard numerous stories of breaking through the ice while people are going out hunting, which really does threaten not just that one life or even meal, but the ability to pass down these traditional practices and techniques. In addition to this, shifting migration patterns due to ocean temperature fluctuations have yielded less reliable harvests. So, for instance, last year in Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, on the north coast, or on the northernmost point in Alaska, for instance, the fall whaling season did not return to harvest until near Thanksgiving, while this year they just harvested their first whale, like last week. And according to locals and to some researchers, from NOAA, this difference in migration pattern was really directly tied to warmer ocean temperatures. And so you can see here the challenges with sea ice, shore fast ice, reliability, making it more dangerous to harvest the proteins that they both need for sustenance and for fulfilling their traditional practices, along with the shift of migration patterns for some of these sea mammals is really creating a situation in which food security feels threatened. Another example is a more land-based example, and reindeer herders are also facing really significant challenges. At the right, the map shows the extent of reindeer herding cultures in the Arctic. This notably includes the Sami of Northern Europe and Russia and the Yamal and Nenets of Russia. And Sanna Vanar, who is pictured in the left of the screen, she's a young Sami reindeer herder from Jokkmokk in Sweden, and she's really a strong advocate for food security. So, interesting situation from her perspective is that in addition to pressures from tourism and resource development in Northern Europe, reindeer populations are more and more encountering iced tundra. So this is the result of rain falling on snow, making the tundra lichen upon which the reindeer subsist impossible to eat. And so the reindeer starve. The effect, so interesting here is that the effect of the climate change driven seasonal fluctuations really cannot be disentangled from the political and social setting which supports or disregards indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination. So now I'll move on to the next consideration, which is cultural vitality. And we'll go back again to Shishmaref. So we really do need to begin to consider places which are in jeopardy, existential jeopardy due to climate impacts. Back in Shishmaref, which is located on a barrier island you can see in the photo at the top on the Bering Sea, climate change really is an existential threat, and much of the infrastructure in the town is threatened due to erosion. You can see that in the photo at the bottom. Residents of the village have voted and narrowly approved moving the entire village to another site on the mainland. But this has brought up an interesting tension between community members who are rooted to this certain place, the financial consideration of the cost of moving the entire village, and a lot of internal tensions for a lot of community members. And there are, I'd like to say, a number of other villages in a similar situation, certainly in Alaska. But then we can also begin to think about this as an issue that's affecting many coastal communities around the country and the world. So here's just another young advocate for his community, Gabe Stenek, also from Shishmaref. He says that our ancestors have lived on this island for hundreds of years. We're accustomed to life by the sea ice. Our values and practices are all based on having the ocean nearby. Moving to a new site would erase that. We can see here that deep tension, both for Gabe himself and for the community at large. A desire to continue living and raising generations in the way that this village has become accustomed, and the desire to be safe from storms and have safe homes and buildings. And I think that, I used some examples of how food security has been threatened in Shishmaref with sea ice unreliability, but we can see that it adds up to so much more than that. It really is about the continuity and the vitality of this particular culture, which has developed its own style of dance, its own food preparation, its own community vibe, just as all of our communities develop. their own unique traits. And so finally, I just wanted to bring your attention to the role of researchers working broadly across the Arctic. As many of you likely know, the Arctic is where a lot of climate research is happening, in addition to ecological and biological research. And I'm guessing that some of you may have done or currently do research in the Arctic region. And on the whole, most of this research is done by non-Indigenous researchers from academic institutions outside the Arctic. The model on this slide is a co-production of knowledge model which promotes equity through meaningful involvement of Arctic indigenous inhabitants in research activities. And this was a model that was developed by people from Coeric, which is the Tribal Social Service Organization for the Bering Straits region, along with ICC, Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Pew Charitable Trusts. And this model promotes collaboration between outside researchers and Arctic inhabitants at all levels, beginning with relationship and research question development, and then analysis and review of results. Coeric has been spearheading this work and has also provided specific, clear feedback to the NSF, the National Science Foundation, on a number of their research priorities, including the status of Indigenous involvement in research for their navigating the new Arctic theme. Co-production of knowledge is a way to marry vital research on climate extremes in the rapidly changing Arctic with the also really vital needs of local communities. And if you live and work in the Arctic, I hope you spend a little bit more time with this model and think about how you can incorporate local and traditional knowledge meaningfully into your research at multiple levels of the research process. I think it's important for us to not just think about equity as something that's happening to other people and in places that are potentially far away, but also as something that we can engage in producing through our daily work and lives. And I think that this model really does a nice job of describing how particularly climate research can engage in this work as well. So with that, I'll just say thank you, and I look forward to discussing more with you in our question period.